Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a body of work that offers a really, a pretty fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling look at the psychology of crowds.
Yeah, definitely unsettling at times. Our sources today really focus on understanding group behavior, not just from the outside, but by looking deep inside the individual, especially the unconscious mind.
Right. So the idea is you can't grasp the crowd without grasping the hidden stuff within us.
Exactly. So our mission really is to unpack the core arguments in these sources. Like, what is a crowd in this view? It's not what you might think.
Okay.
And then what are the psychological mechanics driving it? And, what's the impact on us, on society, even on big ideas like democracy?
So think of this as us guiding you through these specific sources, pulling out the key takeaways from this particular perspective.
We'll start with that definition, what makes a crowd a crowd. Then we'll dig into the unconscious, how crowd thinking kind of works,
Why it's so compelling.
right? Why we get drawn in. And finally, the sources have some provocative thoughts on education as maybe a partial antidote.
Okay, let's dive into that first big question now. When these sources talk about a crowd, they don't just mean any bunch of people, right? Like, my family having dinner, we're a group, we're social, but we're not really a crowd in this sense.
That's spot on. The source material is super clear about this. Being social is just, normal interaction, a family, friends chatting, that's social.
Uh-huh.
A crowd is something else entirely. It's not just people physically together. It's marked by this peculiar psychic change that happens inside individuals because they're part of that group.
So it's not about the numbers, really. It's about what's happening in their head.
Precisely. The core idea here is that a crowd is fundamentally a state of mind.
Okay.
And this pushes back against older theories like Le Bon's idea of some mystical common humanity emerging or just saying it's all suggestion and imitation. Those describe what happens, maybe, but not why.
And the source material uses some pretty intense comparisons to explain this crowd mind, doesn't it?
It really does. The central argument is that the best way to get a handle on the crowd mind is to compare it to individual psychological states that are, detached from normal reality or conscious control.
Like what?
Like dreams, delusions, maybe states you see in compulsion neurosis or somnambulism. Even comparing it to a paranoiac episode.
Wow, okay.
The ideas that grip a crowd, this perspective says, are like complexes or fixations in an individual. They're symbolic, they're tied to stuff that's usually repressed, hidden away in the unconscious.
Comparing crowds to paranoia or dreams, that's definitely a strong image. So how does this unconscious connection actually shape what a crowd does? How does it play out?
Well, the argument is that the big controlling ideas in a crowd, they don't bubble up from, careful, rational thinking.
Right.
Instead, they erupt from impulses way down in the unconscious. They function a lot like those complexes we just talked about.
And being in the crowd somehow
Yeah.
lets these impulses out, gives
You're-
them permission.
Yes, exactly. The crowd state acts like a kind of collective hall pass. It opens a door for what the source calls the primitive ego, the more basic, less socially filtered parts of ourselves, to chase after repressed wishes. Because you feel everyone else is sort of with you. You sense this unspoken agreement, this assent from others. So impulses or desires that you'd normally keep locked down, suddenly they feel okay to act on because others are doing it too or seem to approve. The immediate group feeling aligns with that inner urge.
So you might know what you're doing
Yeah.
consciously, but the usual internal brakes are off. The guilt mechanism isn't working.
That's a great way to put it. Individuals are often fully aware of their actions or words in the moment, but the meaning, the moral significance, it just transforms.
Ah.
Instead of feeling wrong, the action feels justified. And it often gets wrapped up in these grand ideas, moral principles, the good of society.
So it disguises the real, maybe less noble, unconscious motive.
Precisely. The crowd supplies the justification.
Makes sense.
And these powerful crowd ideas, they don't always just pop up out of nowhere. They can actually build up in the unconscious over time, kind of lying dormant, waiting for a trigger.
Like underlying tensions.
Yeah, the source mentions things like historical examples, unconscious hostilities simmering between groups before something specific happens, like the Frank case or certain post-war riots. The potential was already there.
And what does the behavior actually look like when this state takes over? Is it weird?
It can be very different from normal individual behavior because these crowd ideas are so fixed and compulsive. Individuals can become almost stereotyped. ceremonial even.
Like robots.
Like automatons, yeah. Moving together based on this internal compulsive logic of the crowd's fixed idea. But what's really telling is what happens after.
When they leave the crowd.
Right. When an individual gets back to their normal life, they come to, as the source puts it, their usual internal controls, their reason kick back in, those unconscious impulses get pushed back down. Then they might feel real shame, maybe even disgust at how they acted or what they felt while they were part of the crowd.
That feeling of shame afterwards really highlights how different that state must be. Okay, so let's talk more about the thinking process itself. How does this crowd mind actually think and communicate? What are its hallmarks?
It definitely has its own patterns, like speeches or rhetoric aimed at firing up a crowd. The source says it often relies on, well, pathos, appealing to baser emotions, plus ridicule, and lots of platitudes.
Platitudes, like simple, obvious statements.
Yeah, focusing on the obvious, the general, the abstract, the superficial. Why? Because that stuff requires the least amount of thinking, right? It taps into what people already vaguely agree on, that natural uniformity.
Like political slogans. Simple, broad, maybe a bit empty.
Exactly like that. And abstract words, think justice, freedom, truth, they operate differently in a crowd. The source compares them to worn banknotes.
Worn banknotes.
Meaning they're symbolic tokens. They're used mainly to get people aligned to direct behavior rather than conveying any deep, personal, nuanced meaning. The individual richness of those concepts just gets flattened out.
So words become tools for conformity, not really communication.
Pretty much. And the beliefs themselves, they tend to harden into ends in themselves. People cling to them fiercely. They'll vindicate them by just ignoring facts that contradict them.
Protecting the belief becomes the main goal.
Right. It's not about testing ideas against reality anymore. It's about defending the fort.
Yeah, you see that. Ignoring inconvenient truths.
And this rigidity makes crowds really susceptible to rumors and to what the source calls compulsive thinking. Again, there's that parallel drawn to the fixed delusions of a paranoiac. The thinking is driven by internal needs, emotional logic, not by checking against the outside world.
It's like the crowd builds its own little bubble reality.
It really does seem that way. And like we said, it's temporary for the individual. That moment of waking up and feeling shame, that's when their normal connection to, verifiable reality guided by reason comes back online and pushes those crowd ideas back underground.
Okay, so we have this picture. The crowd as a mental state, unconscious impulses driving it, a kind of rigid, simplistic thinking. But why is it so powerful? Why do people get sucked in? What needs does it actually meet?
Well, the sources argue it taps into some fundamental needs related to the ego, our sense of self. You know how a paranoiac's fixed ideas can weirdly protect their self-esteem?
Yeah.
The crowd state seems to work similarly. It acts as this powerful prop for boosting self-worth, even if it's in a kind of distorted way.
How does it manage that?
It seems to provide an outlet for, well, the source calls it the repressed infantile psyche, basically parts of our childhood self. The crowd can feel like it's stepping into the role of the parent in loco parentis.
Spanning in for the parents.
Yeah. It offers that sense of security, belonging that maybe was felt or desired in childhood. You get new brothers and sisters, you feel less personally responsible, you're okay with being told what to do. It's like transferring that need for safety from the family to the crowd. It allows for a kind of psychological step back, in a way.
Okay. Finding safety and belonging in this big guiding group.
Exactly. And you often see this play out as intense self-praise, even megalomania within the crowd. Individuals basically project their own suppressed feelings of pride or importance onto the idea of the crowd.
So they might not feel great alone, but the crowd is amazing.
Right. Then they can boast and feel important through the crowd without personal shame. We are the chosen ones. We have the real truth. We're the best patriots, that kind of thing.
So the crowd becomes like an inflated, idealized version of the self.
Yeah, pretty much. And another key trait, the will to dominate. Crowds nearly always express this, often through big promises of future victory, usually over some rival group.
And I bet they hate being criticized or laughed at.
Oh, absolutely. Fiercely protective of their dignity and honor. Crowds generally have zero sense of humor about their core ideas. They cling to these ideals not because they've tested them or found them true,
But because
those ideas are doing crucial psychological work. They're propping up that inflated ego, keeping uncomfortable, unconscious conflicts buried. If you question the ideals, you're not just disagreeing, you're threatening the whole psychological structure holding the crowd together and the individual's fragile peace within it.
you can't just argue someone out of it with facts
Yeah.
if the belief isn't based on fact to begin with. Okay.
Exactly. It's serving an internal function, not reflecting external reality. You can't reason a paranoiac out of their delusion easily either for similar reasons.
That's a really key distinction. Beliefs as psychological tools versus beliefs as truth claims. Okay, let's dig into those mechanisms you mentioned earlier. Compensation and projection. How do those work inside a crowd?
Right. So compensation is where the crowd's activities or beliefs kind of make up for something lacking in an individual's life, maybe a sense of failure, loss, or sacrifice.
Okay, like feeling powerful in the crowd makes up for feeling powerless elsewhere.
Sort of, yeah. And projection is maybe even more central. The intense hostility a crowd directs outwards, it's often a projection of the members' own internal conflicts, things they don't like about themselves, or forbidden impulses they struggle with.
Can you give an example?
The source uses examples like someone getting really worked up about, say, modern fashion changes might actually be projecting their own suppressed erotic feelings, or people obsessed with gossiping about scandals might be vicariously enjoying the forbidden acts they condemn in others.
Wow.
And the real fanatic, the core crowd person, they often try to make their own internal struggles universal. They see their virtues and vices as linked, justifying their actions. That's another type of compensation.
So you basically see your own unwanted stuff in someone else and then attack it there instead of dealing with it in yourself.
That's the mechanism, yes.
Correct.
And this shapes the crowd's ethics. The source argues crowd ethics are almost always negative, focused on don'ts, prohibitions, taboos, rigid rules handed down.
Mm-hmm.
This is contrasted with what's seen as a healthy moral sense, which grows through experience and aims for, a richer life, not just avoiding bad things. Those ready-made moral codes, the source mentions things like the Ten Commandments or even Kant's categorical imperative, when used rigidly by a crowd, exemplify this type of external fixed standard.
So it's a morality of thou shalt not, applied very strictly.
Often, yeah. And crucially, this negative ethic almost always needs an enemy. The crowd is nearly always against someone.
Why?
Because that intense hatred defends the crowd's own shaky self-esteem, its injured self-feeling, by projecting it onto an external target. And once you have that target, it provides a perfect excuse for aggression, even violence, especially if the crowd feels strong enough to ignore normal social rules.
Justifying violence.
Yeah, think of race riots, pogroms, revolutionary mobs, even nationalistic fervor in wartime. The source cites these as examples where projection fuels hostility.
And who gets the worst of it?
The heretic, the nonconformist, the insider who breaks ranks, or the outsider who refuses to join. To the crowd mind, rejecting its core ideas is the ultimate threat, the unforgivable sin, because it shakes the very foundation the crowd is built on. That's why political, religious, moral crowds can be so vicious towards dissenters.
Because independent thought is the enemy, which loops back to what you said about the crowd mind being abstract and kind of out of touch with reality.
Absolutely, it connects directly. The crowd mind is described as fundamentally idealistic and absolutist. Its truths aren't discovered, they're given, fixed, made in advance. They aren't really open to debate or testing. And even though these belief systems are serving those hidden ego needs we talked about, they feel impersonal and abstract to the people inside the crowd.
Like downloading a complete operating system for belief.
That's a good analogy. And again, the source draws that parallel to the paranoiac, who retreats from the messy complexity of the real world into a neat, fixed, ideal system inside their head. A reality based on pure reason that feels safer, more manageable.
Right.
Crowd thinking does something similar. It builds this imaginary world out of abstract concepts and takes shelter there, away from the difficulties of engaging with actual concrete reality.
So it's a kind of mental fortress against uncertainty.
That's the idea. And the source explicitly links this to philosophical absolutism, think a capital A absolutism, like philosophical idealism or rationalism. Plato gets mentioned as someone seeking ultimate reality in pure knowledge,
Right.
separate from the body and messy experience.
And why would people find that attractive?
Psychologically, the source suggests motivations like spiritual pride, just enjoying making broad generalizations, that craving for unity, but especially a deep-seated desire for security, for cosmic stability, a need for a priori truth, truth guaranteed in advance, to feel safe from chaos. The psychologist Alfred Adler's idea that this craving for certainty fuels both neurotic and normal fictions is brought in here too.
Building that fortress of ideas to feel safe.
Pretty much. And the source makes the bold claim that your average crowd member, no matter how unsophisticated they seem, is basically a Platonist at heart. They value the abstract idea more than the concrete experience. You see this in religious crowds, political reform crowds, patriotic crowds, even radical crowds claiming to be materialists.
And thinkers who don't fit that, who focus on the messy reality.
They're the opposite pole. People who emphasize facts, consequences, lived experience, the pragmatists, the humanists, figures like William James or F.C.S. Schiller mentioned in the source, their way of thinking tends to break down the crowd mind structures
Wow.
because they constantly call you back to yourself, back to testing ideas against reality, which is probably why the source implies their ideas often aren't as popular in crowd-driven societies. It's uncomfortable work.
Right. Engaging with reality means leaving the comfort of the abstract fortress.
Exactly. Crowds use these abstract principles like a defensive wall, a flaming hedge, to keep criticism and inconvenient facts out. The principles end up controlling the people, demanding conformity instead of being tools people use to understand and act in the world.
Wow. This obviously has massive implications for, like, politics and government.
Huge implications. The source argues that people caught up in crowd thinking, it doesn't matter much if they're on the political left or right when they get power, they tend to behave similarly.
How so?
You see the same patterns: self-praise, relying on rigid abstract principles, and exploiting those who aren't part of their crowd.
So the political label is less important than the underlying crowd mentality.
That's the argument. And trends towards more state control, more bureaucracy. The source views these critically, warning about a potential coming slavery, echoing Herbert Spencer. It points to the constant increase in laws, taxes, regulations, often pushed by various reformist crowds trying to impose their specific vision on everyone.
Can you give some examples they mention?
They mention things from the post-WWI era, like espionage laws used broadly, government snooping into private opinions, suppressing dissent under the guise of things like Americanization propaganda. The point is that new crowds in power often just dust off the oppressive tools used by the old crowds they replaced.
So it's a repeating cycle, just different groups using the same control tactics.
And think about the contrast drawn between older monarchies, which might have been absolute but only in a few specific areas, and modern democracy, which often tries to regulate way more aspects of life. The source brings in Alexis de Tocqueville's famous observation about the tyranny of the majority in America. De Tocqueville felt there was actually less real freedom of opinion there than in Europe at the time, precisely because of the intense social pressure to conform.
And that pressure comes
From crowds, both majority and minority crowds, using social pressure, sometimes economic coercion. There's an example given of a Liberty Bond Committee during WWI leaning hard on a farmer, showing how this crowd-driven pressure can override individual rights or circumstances.
What about the idea of opportunity in democracy? How is that viewed?
It gets a really sharp critique. The source argues that opportunity often gets reduced to just meaning the freedom to chase money to get ahead commercially. But this isn't seen as real individualism. It's called a pseudo-individualism that's actually driven by a crowd idea, the idea that being superior means having more stuff. This encourages selfishness,
Yeah.
but also, ironically, a deep spiritual conformity, everyone chasing the same narrow goal.
That's a pretty critical take. What about freedom of speech?
Also critiqued. In this context, the source argues, freedom of speech often just means freedom for different crowds to blast out their propaganda while trying to shut down their rivals, and especially trying to silence the individual who doesn't belong to any powerful crowd.
So freedom for the organized groups, but maybe not for the lone voice.
That's the worry. The historical example used is the Puritans demanding freedom for themselves, but denying it to Quakers or Catholics. It's seen as a parallel to modern attempts to suppress political or artistic views that challenge a dominant crowd. It becomes, quote, the liberty of crowds to be crowds.
Freedom for collective noise, potentially drowning out individual thought.
Right, and this leads towards a kind of freedom from having to think for yourself, freedom from moral responsibility. It gets replaced by just going along, mechanically conforming, whether it's law or just social pressure. The danger, the source warns, is democracy becoming inanity, making people act good automatically, without any real inner effort or moral substance.
And the effect on creativity, on new ideas.
It leads to what's called a tyranny of the commonplace. Genuine originality, real genius. It often gets squashed unless it fits the popular mood. Artists, writers feel pressure to conform or face being ignored or attacked. This is contrasted with how society might celebrate, say, industrialists who embody that crowd idea of success, even if their methods are questionable. Intellectual freedom gets stifled, especially, the source warns, in education.
It paints a picture of a really powerful, often negative, force shaping society. What about big upheavals like revolutions? Are they a chance to break free from this?
The source analysis looks at revolution primarily as a psychological event, a crowd phenomenon. The argument is that the real fight often isn't just about economics, but about the assumed superiority and the will to dominate of the revolutionary crowd versus the old dominant crowd.
So it's basically one crowd trying to kick out another and take its place.
That's the core psychological dynamic highlighted, yes. A revolutionary crowd, just like any other crowd according to this view, wants to rule. It wants to swap the old tyranny for its own tyranny. Society is seen as these different struggle groups, these organized crowds, all fighting for the top spot.
But what about the ideals? The dream of a totally new, free world that often inspires revolutions.
That social idealism, the vision of utopia, paradise on earth, whatever you call it, the source, sees it mainly as a psychological mechanism. It's compensation and escape for all those suppressed desires. It often uses religious language and imagery, even in movements that claim to be secular, like some socialist movements mentioned. It acts more as a powerful symbol of a magical place where all your wishes come true, rather than a practical scientific plan for changing society.
So the inspiring vision is more about psychology than policy.
And the source also points out a common thinking error in revolutions, the system fallacy. Confusing a description, like the economic system, with a single active cause of all problems. It lets people blame an abstract thing instead of grappling with the complex, messy reality.
And what's the usual trajectory? How do revolutions tend to play out, according to this view?
Often there's that initial burst of excitement, feeling magnanimous, like a new age is dawning.
Right.
But then reality bites. Routine sets in, old conflicts reemerge, there are calls for revenge against the old guard, counter-revolutions start.
Things get messy.
Very. Suspicion grows, and critically, the most extreme factions often end up taking control. This pattern, seen in examples like the French and Russian revolutions, frequently leads to some form of dictatorship.
The hardliners take over.
Yes, and the argument is that the new group in charge, whether it's, say, an intellectual elite in a Soviet system or powerful labor groups or whatever, they'll likely use their power to create new privileges for themselves and exploit others. The underlying pattern of crowd dominance just repeats, maybe with new labels.
That's a pretty pessimistic take on revolutions achieving lasting freedom. Is there any way out of this cycle? What's the suggested fix, the antidote to all this crowd thinking?
Well, the main hope offered is education. But, and this is a huge but, the source is incredibly critical of traditional education.
Why? What's wrong with it?
The argument is that traditional schooling often actually feeds crowd thinking. It does this by, for example, separating thinking from doing, treating knowledge like just passively absorbing facts, building up abstract systems that have no connection to real-life problems. This kind of learning, the source claims, actually makes people more susceptible to crowd mentality later on.
Okay, so not that kind of education. What's the alternative they propose?
They advocate for a humanist way of thinking. This is presented as the thing that can actually break down those rigid mental structures the crowd mind relies on. It's framed as a kind of re-education.
Re-education, what does that involve?
It means consciously facing reality, and maybe even more importantly, facing yourself, understanding your own motivations and biases, honestly. It's about judging ideas based on whether they actually work, whether they check out against facts and real experience. It's fundamentally a pragmatic approach.
So ideas are only good if they're useful in the real world, not just because they sound logical or fit a system.
Exactly. This humanist view sees big concepts, justice, truth, beauty, not as some fixed heavenly things, but as descriptions of actual human activities and what happens because of them. Reality is concrete human experience, all those abstract systems. They're seen as logical fictions, useful sometimes, maybe, but still fictions.
And knowledge itself.
Knowledge is a tool. Ideas are instruments, guides for acting effectively in the world, not just static pictures of reality you hang on your mental wall. That whole idea of the absolute truth, seen as a convenient fiction that lets you off the hook from the hard work of actually testing your ideas against life.
It sounds much more demanding, more active.
It absolutely is. This humanist approach forces you to take personal responsibility. You have to engage with the concrete world, figure things out, make your own life richer through that effort. And that process, the source argues, directly counters the conformist pull of the crowd. Why? Because it demands this effort of attention to concrete reality and the fact of self. And that effort is deeply personal, unique, not something you can do by just blending in.
Right, it's the opposite of the crowd's desire to lose yourself in the group.
It's presented as the only real way to overcome those crowd compulsions, developing the ability and the courage to stand alone as a thinking individual. Psychoanalysis even gets mentioned as a kind of personalized version of this re-education.
Okay, so
By helping the individual ego become more grounded, more genuinely social, precisely by facing itself, honestly, its flaws, its desires, and learning to relate to others based on that reality, not on the fictions the crowd offers.
So self-knowledge and testing ideas against reality, that's the core defense against the crowd.
That's the conclusion drawn by these sources, yes. Real freedom, the real solution to the social problem, isn't about finding the perfect external system. It's about individuals stopping the self-deception, stopping the crowd mummery, the play acting.
Uh,
It means using ideas as real tools for real jobs and ditching abstract principles when they're just being used as shields to protect a fragile ego or hide unconscious motives. It's about trying to see ourselves, others, and the world more clearly without the flattering but ultimately dangerous distortions of the crowd.
okay, so to kind of wrap up this deep dive, we've journeyed through these really thought-provoking sources, exploring this challenging idea that a crowd isn't just people, it's a psychological state.
Yeah, a state driven by these deep unconscious forces leading to these patterns we see: projection, compensation, this drive to dominate, and often retreating into abstract ideals that can become quite tyrannical.
Now, we've seen how this isn't just about angry mobs in the street. This kind of crowd thinking is presented as this constant pressure influencing politics, freedom, religion, even how we educate people.
It's a significant challenge these sources lay out, suggesting how deeply these patterns might be embedded in us and in our societies. And the path forward offered here isn't about rearranging the deck chairs politically, necessarily. It's about cultivating independent thought, real self-knowledge within each person.
Through that humanist, pragmatic approach.
Exactly. Learning to check our ideas against reality, accepting our own complexities, and engaging with the world as individuals who can actually resist that powerful, seductive pull of the crowd.
It's really a call to become, as you said, a non-crowd person, to individuate,
Indeed. That seems to be the core message.
which definitely leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away. Given how deeply this crowd thinking might be woven into our psychology and our world, how can you start to recognize its influence in your own life, in the groups you're part of, in the news you consume? And what does it really take today to cultivate the ability and maybe the courage to truly stand alone?